This is a bookable summary of the book Anxious by Joseph Ledoux. Many of us experience some level of anxiety in our everyday lives. One of the prominent mental health problems in America is anxiety. Today, 40 million people live with this diagnosis. But what does it mean to have a disordered level of anxiety? And how do anxiety disorders develop? Follow through as we will be diving deep into those questions and examining the treatment options that have emerged. Number 1. Anxiety was once seen as an essential part of being human. The concept of anxiety has existed for ages. Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish theologian, made this claim in his 1844 book, The Concept of Anxiety. He defined anxiety as a result of human decision-making capacity and evidence that we are conscious of the power and responsibility of free will. Anxiety used to be considered a necessary feature of being human. This idea that anxiety is a necessary feeling had a significant impact. According to Freud, anxiety is a key component of many psychopathological conditions and is a symptom that we have been attempting to repress trauma and bad memories. As a result of Freud's theory, anxiety is no longer seen as a natural aspect of human existence, but rather as a problem that has to be fixed. After World War II, his theory of anxiety became widely recognised. The phrase, "the age of anxiety," was first used by poet W. H. Auden in 1947, when he published his well-known book of the same name. Every generation ever since has utilised it extensively. Today, a simple Google search for anxiety will return over 42 million results, proving that anxiety disorder is a common topic of conversation. Number 2. The criteria for diagnosing anxiety disorders are constantly changing. An anxiety condition may typically only be diagnosed by a psychologist or psychiatrist. We need to examine the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM, to understand how they come to these conclusions. The American Psychiatric Association published the DSM in the middle of the 20th century, and it is currently the most widely used classification system for psychiatric disorders. Mental disorders were categorized into the states of psychosis and neurosis in the first edition of the DSM. The latter category included anxiety as anxiety neurosis. This category was subdivided into generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, and panic disorders in the third version of the DSM in 1980. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and certain phobias were added to these categories in the subsequent version, which was released in 1994. The criteria for diagnosing anxiety disorders are constantly changing. A psychologist will assess their client's symptoms concerning a DSM checklist before making a diagnosis. A person is deemed to have an anxiety disorder if they exhibit a particular number of the same symptoms. The DSM has drawn criticism for trying to fit a very complicated condition into a simple checklist, and for giving people potentially stigmatizing psychiatric designations. What, therefore, predisposes a person to anxiety disorders? The first is genetics. Anxiety problems can be inherited from a parent or handed down through generations. The second is about people's general psychological makeup and how they manage uncertainty. The third relates to your upbringing or learning experiences. Later in this video, we'll discover how we learn about threats in greater depth. Number 3. We all have well-developed survival instincts to counter threats. The well-known fight or flight theory was developed by psychologist Walter Cannon in the early stages of the 20th century. According to the theory, when animals are threatened, they will either freeze and act dead, flee, or retaliate by defending themselves. The same survival instincts are ingrained into all humans, just like how you would behave if you encountered a violent dog barking at you, or feeling threatened by a hostile colleague. The fact is, we all have a highly developed survival instinct to counter the threat. When we perceive a threat, the adrenal medulla releases the energy-boosting hormone adrenaline into our bodies, activating our sympathetic nervous system. But how do we determine what poses a threat? We primarily learn about danger through experience. Verbal instructions and observational learning are other ways in which we can learn about threats. We need our innate survival mechanisms because they keep us alive. Sometimes, though, they tend to fly into overdrive and perceive threats where there is none. Number 4. Having an anxiety disorder puts you on high alert for potential threats. People with anxiety disorders are constantly on the lookout for danger. When a person has a specific phobia, such as arachnophobia, they are hypervigilant around that object. People with social anxiety disorders are also hypervigilant in social settings. This can make an otherwise enjoyable event seem like a minefield of potential embarrassment. The major point from this is that having an anxiety disorder makes you hypervigilant for potential risks. The hypervigilance keeps our bodies prepared to deal with danger and our minds focused on the source of the threats. It also keeps our survival systems in a constant high alert state. When a person struggles to distinguish between genuine and imagined threats, they often suffer from anxiety disorders. As a result, this causes them to react excessively to circumstances that don't threaten their lives. People with generalized anxiety disorder don't have a specific trigger to avoid. Instead, they experience a constant stream of anxious thoughts about anything and everything. But this kind of thinking is in itself a form of avoidant behaviour. Avoiding potential anxiety triggers can bring temporary relief, since the fears are never confronted head-on. They just loom larger and larger. Number 5. Fear and anxiety are feelings that humans process consciously. The majority of what neuroscientists know about human brains comes from experiments with animals. They have gained valuable knowledge about how human survival mechanisms function by studying how animals such as rats react to the threat. In scientific literature, animals have been referred to exhibit fear responses when they attack or freeze in response to a threat. That might lead us to conclude that animals also experience fear just as humans do, but this is a misconception. There is a significant difference between reacting defensively to survive an attack and consciously experiencing fear. The main point from this is that fear and anxiety are emotions that people consciously process. Instinctive, unconscious cognitive pathways in our brains control the survival response. However, conscious cognitive processes produce fear and worry. Researchers will be missing human emotions, which is a key component if they base their understanding of anxiety on an experiment with animals only. Distinguishing between survival responses and emotion is crucial when we're attempting to figure out how to treat anxiety. Number 6. Cognitive behavioural therapeutic approaches are effective in treating anxiety. We're all familiar with scenarios where a therapist is taking notes and combing his beard as a client lies on a couch and talks about her childhood. These common settings were inspired by Freud-era psychoanalysis. However, even though Freud was one of the pioneers in introducing the idea of anxiety to psychology, modern therapeutic approaches are very different. Talk therapy is how Freud helped patients with psychological issues that have their roots in their past. Nowadays, cognitive behavioural techniques, which focus more on current behaviour, form the foundation of the majority of therapy treatments for anxiety. Instead of examining the reason, they focus on the symptoms. Therefore, cognitive behavioural therapy works well for treating anxiety. Cognitive therapies aim to assist patients to sort out faulty core beliefs that unnecessarily trigger avoidance and survival behaviours, while behavioural therapies aim to treat debilitating behavioural patterns themselves. Both approaches mainly involve exposure treatment. Exposure treatment can be helpful by giving patients a space to identify anxiety triggers and the types of habitual anxieties that follow. Number 7. Exposure therapy is remarkably effective, but it has limitations. Exposure therapy has 70% effectiveness according to research. However, it has a few drawbacks. One is that the extinction of negative associations is particularly context-specific. What you learn in the therapist's office might not apply in the real world. Exposure therapy's results can be reversed, which is even more problematic. New traumatic occurrences are a common source of this. It's also possible for old associations to come back after some time has lapsed, in what is known as spontaneous recovery. Therefore, exposure therapy has many advantages, but it has limitations. Another drawback of exposure therapy is that you can only eliminate associations that you can recall consciously, but most of our memories are stored in our unconscious. Fortunately, there are measures therapists can take to improve the durability and effectiveness of exposure therapy. In addition to these behavioural approaches, combining exposure therapy with a short pharmacological therapy has also been successful. These methods could improve the chances of extinction, but what if there is a different approach? What if we could completely remove harmful memories and associations from our brains? Number 8. Memories can be retrieved and updated with new information. People find the idea of erasing memories so unpleasant that it's almost taboo to use it as psychological treatment. There was a stir when Joseph Ledoux and his colleagues released a study demonstrating that they had found a mechanism to help rats forget traumatic memories. The main takeaway from this is that memories may be retrieved and updated with fresh data. However, the researchers were able to make the rats forget their painful experience by giving them an injection that prevents protein synthesis into a region of the brain known as the lateral amygdala. The researchers hypothesized that a similar process could be performed on people. However, this conclusion drew strong criticism. Studies have revealed that memories can be modified by the addition of new information each time one is recovered, but the ability to entirely delete memories in people is very difficult, even though memory is dynamic. Number 9. Active coping strategies can help you to regulate your anxiety. A great number of people struggle with anxiety disorders. People who can use a variety of active coping methods are particularly resilient when faced with anxiety. This is according to research by George Bonanno. A socially anxious person might, for instance, manage their discomfort at a party by frequently leaving to use the restroom or take a phone call. This can appear to be avoidant conduct, which we've established to be bad. However, deliberate avoidance can be a helpful coping mechanism. The main takeaway from this is that you can control your anxiety by using active coping mechanisms. After a traumatic experience, active coping may sometimes look like social interaction. Breathing exercises and anxiety-relieving medication practices are other active coping mechanisms that have gained prominence recently. Active coping skills are highly subjective. It involves figuring out what techniques work for you and maintaining a variety of them on hand. What's your most important key takeaway? Please comment down below and share the video if you like it. Thank you, and until next time.